Andy, over the years, you must have, you've commentated on a variety of sports and you've covered a variety of sports and you've made mention of these elite athletes already. Is there a particular game, event, interview that stands out to you as something that has left you in awe?
Yes, and you would never guess it in a million years.
Hello, sports fans, and welcome to another episode of the Xpect Performance podcast. Today, I have Andy Capostagno. He has been a commentator and a sports journalist with Supersport for over 30 years. And if you're a fan of sport globally, this is going to be an episode for you. Throughout this episode, Andy shares stories from what made Ernie Els so great to in his opinion, the best Sharks rugby team that he's ever seen. What makes a good commentator, as well as the story that left him and still has him in awe that he's experienced firsthand on a sporting field. I absolutely love this episode as a sports fan myself. I absolutely know that you will too. Please like, share, subscribe, and enjoy. Andy Capostagno, welcome to the Xpect Performance podcast, sir. Lovely to have you.
Thank you, Clinton. Thank you for the invite.
Yes, I'm looking forward to this. So I love a good story, Andy, and I'll start this interview with a story of mine. My little boy, you've just met, Grayson, he's 6 months old now, and as I rock him to sleep in our rocking chair at home, I put my headphones in, and then I hop onto YouTube, and whatever's there, I peruse through, and as he's nodding off. And I'm a big rugby fan, big Sharks fan, big Springboks fan. And something came up as a suggestion. It was the top tries of the 1996 Sharks. And that's first Super Rugby season, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
First Super 12, actually. And goodness gracious, just Henry Honeyball, Kevin Putt, Jeremy Thompson, James Small, Teichmann, Joubert. And then you started blasting through my speakers, commentating on a game in 1996. And I'm very familiar with your voice, and Durbanites around the province are with the work that you do at Supersport. But I couldn't believe that your relationship with Supersport had extended that far back. So can you tell me about the journey that has been thus far with Supersport and your journey into commentary?
Yeah, well, of course, I started working for them before they were Supersport. Supersport was only launched in around about 1996. Before then, it was Mnet. And I blundered into a commentary at Ellis Park. Long story short, I came to South Africa on a paid holiday and never went home in November of 92. In February 93, I was asked by the Daily Telegraph in the UK to cover Harlequins, who were playing in the Mnet Night Series. And the Mnet Night Series was created by Mnet because they had no rugby. In those days, SABC owned everything. So they would have pre-season tournament at Ellis Park. I think there were about 6 or 8 teams playing. And I turned up, sat in the press box, and I've never felt so out of place before or since. I was given a program, and it was entirely in Afrikaans. Even the adverts were in Afrikaans. And it had the team lists in it, so I needed it. And when I was working in the UK, rugby was one string to my bow, but I was a cricket man, really. And I was looking around this stadium and hearing an unfamiliar voice and language being spoken, and feeling really like a fish out of water when somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "I believe you commentate." And I looked around, and it was a chap called Rob Orpen, who was Mnet's first rugby director, who'd learned his trade at the SABC. And Rob said, we need a commentator urgently. We've got a man down sick, which turned out to be John Robbie, who'd got laryngitis.
Oh, yes.
And would you come and do a game? So the game I ended up doing was not the Harlequins game, which would have been easy because I knew all of the Harlequins players. Will Carling, the England captain at the time, was the captain of Harlequins, and they were a good side. I ended up doing Namibian Barbarians against Northern Transvaal. And I've never heard a tape of the game, but what I can tell you is that Joost scored the first try. I certainly didn't call him Joost.
Yes.
Or Van der Westhuizen. I'd love to know what I called him. And that was the start. And then I bumped into Rob at a press conference a couple of weeks later, and he said, "Do you want to do some more?" And that was it. So 93 was my first season. 96, I was a gnarled veteran by then.
Yes, yes. You must have seen so many different, let's narrow it down to Sharks rugby for the time being. You must have seen so many different teams and eras throughout the last 31 years. Is there a particular era of Sharks rugby or even season that stands out to you as a commentator and as a fan?
Well, you mentioned the players from 96. That was the time. The 90s, it wasn't just that they were a good side. It was the rugby that they played. And my favourite fullback of all time, Andre Hubert, just lit everything up every time he touched the ball. In my rugby watching life, there have been three fullbacks. JPR Williams, who actually played a season for the Sharks in 1975. Many people don't know that.
Was he the Welshman?
He was the Welshman,
Yes.
part of the great Welsh side of the 70s that turned me onto the game in the first place. The second fullback was Serge Blanco of France, who now has his dream job, which is he's a rep for Ricard, which is an aniseed drink. Okay. And he just goes around France being Serge Blanco. And if you want to look for, if you're listening to this and you're wondering who Serge Blanco is, go and Google the semi-final of the 1987 World Cup, the first World Cup. He scores an amazing try despite the fact that his leg's bandaged because he had a hamstring strain. And then when I came to South Africa, the first time I saw Andre Hubert play, I fell in love. And I'm happy to say that I got to know him very well, and he's still a good friend today. And I will never forgive Nick Mallett for robbing us of 2 years of Juba at the peak of his career because he didn't like his defensive capabilities.
Oh, was that the justification? So he made a couple of big calls then, obviously the Skinstad-Teichmann decision going into the 99 World Cup. Which I'm sure people have never let him live down. What always struck me about Juba is the humility of the man. He would score this most wonderful try, and then he'd just pop the ball down, he'd pick it back up, and then march it back to his kicker, and then he'd present the kicker with the ball, and then that was it.
I'll tell you a lovely Juba story that illustrates exactly what you're talking about, humility. There used to be a steakhouse on Florida Road that we used to frequent. And the manager told me a story one day. He said Juba was in this week with his missus of the time, because he goes through them. And he said they had a nice meal, and it came to pay the bill, and he realized that he didn't have his wallet with him. And He said, look, my wife can stay here. I'll just pop home and get my checkbook, if that's all right. And the guy said, yeah, fine. Juba came back and wrote out a check with a generous tip on it. And the manager said, thank you very much, sent him on his way, and promptly went down and framed it and put it on the wall.
Really, eh?
Yeah.
Oh, that is so cool. That's such a cool story. So the 90s Sharks, okay. At that stage, the stadiums were filling out. There was a buzz. Things have changed.
40,000 people was an ordinary crowd in those days. People forget that South Africa coming out of international isolation was such a huge thing that they hadn't had international competition. And when Super Rugby started, and these teams came over from New Zealand playing amazing rugby with amazing rugby players like Christian Cullen and Jonah Lomu, people couldn't get enough of it. And the other thing to remember is that in those days, I remember coming out of England and thinking, this country is actually rugby mad, because you'd go to the ground early and there'll be a schools game playing. Then there'd be a club game. Then there would be the second team. And finally, you'd get the main game. So you get people in their seats at like 8 o'clock in the morning, and you capture them for a dozen hours. And that, I'm sorry to say, doesn't happen anymore, and it's a shame.
Yeah, it is a shame. But I think times have also changed with technology and accessibility to those games. But as a commentator, do you feed off the energy of the crowds? Like, does it help when you've got the atmosphere and that humdrum of the stadium?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very difficult to do a game when there's nobody in the ground. I do a lot of school sport these days, and the great thing about school sport is that it's always packed. And if it's not packed, even then there's a bubble, there's an atmosphere, and people are they're intrigued about what's happening on the field, whether it be an Astro or a rugby field or a cricket field or whatever. They're invested in what's going on in the game. And if you take that away and you play in empty stadiums, which is inevitable, as you say, because of modern technology, then as a commentator, you find it very difficult. You end up listening to the referee, or listening to the director, which you should never do. Directors, what do they know?
Andy, we mentioned off air, we spoke about school sport. Speak to me about the rise of school sport and how that is becoming more and more mainstream, and how that has grown from strength to strength in recent years.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. When I first arrived in the country, of course, I had no idea that school sport was a thing, because it's not in the UK. And I could never understand why Hugh Bladen, on commentary, and we did about 4 seasons together. He was the commentator, I was his so-called expert, although I knew nothing. And he would say, well, he went to St Andrews, and he went to Pyle Gym, and this, that, and the other. And there was a game at Ellis Park. James Small is playing for Western Province, heading for the line. James Dalton tripped him up.
Okay.
And he didn't score. And Hugh Bladen said on commentary, well, he probably learnt that at Jeppy. He said his phone never stopped the next day, which was Sunday, with, first of all, he had the headmaster of Jeppy shitting all over him. and then anybody who knew him called him up to laugh about what he'd said on air. And it was only then that I sort of got an inkling of the importance of schools. And my first few Craven weeks, where I remember going down the Free State side, and like everybody had gone to Grey, and I'd never been to Grey. Now I've been to Grey, and I understand it. But that the other thing that was important to me was learning about the history of the Springboks and recognizing the fact that so few schools have produced 95% of all Springboks. Now, over the years, I've been lucky. I've been to a lot of those schools, and a lot of others as well. I think the thing that it may save Supersport is Supersport schools, because it is the growth is extraordinary. In 3 years, they've got, I think it's 870,000 people have downloaded the app, and more every day. People watching on Channel 216 who sort of keep it on 216. I'm amazed when I walk down the road, somebody will come up to me and say, oh, I heard you doing the Michael House game, and you think, what, have you not got a life? What's the matter with you? But the school scenario is extraordinary. There are very, very few schools in the country that I've walked into to work where I felt a little bit out of place. Nearly always somebody, whether it be a member of staff, a boy, or a parent, will put me at my ease. Yes. And perhaps in a way that they don't realise they're putting me at my ease. Yeah. But the KwaZulu-Natal schools, which of course I know very well, the first school that really hit me as a commentator was Maritzburg College. I turned up to do a Maritzburg College game in the early days when Supersport was just starting to do schools rugby. And they couldn't do enough for me. They told me about whose father had played previously. They told me about the war cry and can we get you a cup of coffee? And it was so different from professional rugby. And that's the one thing that I fear with schools rugby is that certain schools are taking it to a level where we are professional.
Yes.
And there's a huge backlash in many schools. You'll see in the program on the day, it'll say, don't abuse the referee, remember you're here to have a good time, and don't put pressure on your children to perform. And if there's somebody listening to this who needs a message, that's the message.
Yeah, but it is so captivating, and the fact that all the boys in the schools are, it's compulsory that they attend these big rugby games. I worked at Kersney for 2 years, and that was the years that the Dupree twins were in matric. A number of those players went on to represent KZN at Craven Week and then have made careers in rugby. Tristan Tedder, who now plays at Racing Metro. And it was just such a wonderful atmosphere, and the war cries and the humdrum of the students, and then the old boys get involved. It really is. It's something that anybody can go to and enjoy if they're just a fan of rugby. But you mentioned something earlier, nerves. Speak to me about nerves and how you deal with that in a live commentary situation. Well,
I've had conversations with other commentators over the years. Hugh Bladen I've already mentioned. And in my opinion, if you get nervous, you're in the wrong job. I'm probably more nervous in a situation like this, where I'm having to tell you a little bit about myself, than I ever am in the circumstances of a commentary. The only time you might get nervous is if you're doing a sport that you're not familiar with. So about 15 years ago, I got involved with hockey. And I'm all right with hockey now, but I never played. My school didn't play hockey. And so there are still times in a hockey game where if I haven't got a co-commentator, I have to sort of keep quiet because I really don't know what happened there. Last night, I was at Westville, doing Westville against Northwood hockey. And that was fascinating because I'm doing the under 14s and the under 16s. Nobody's got a number on. So you've got a list of names, but it's useless because you can't put a name to a face. And you have to be able to make it interesting for there to be a reason for there to be a commentator there in the first place. Otherwise, you just put sound effects on and mic up the referee or the umpire, and that's all you need. So the nerve thing, I did athletics earlier this year, and I was commentating on national championships in Pietermaritzburg, and Alyssa Connolly, the former SA sprinter who went to the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics, is by my side. We've got people in the blocks waiting to start a race. There's a full start. So there's time to talk. And I said to Alyssa, well, you can understand the nerves. And you know what she said? She said, if you're nervous, it's too late.
Wow.
That's why you practice.
That's tremendous. And then especially, that's something in golf, especially. You've got so much time between shots. You've got so much time to think about the shot that you hit or didn't hit, or the work that you have done or haven't done, or feeling like a bit like a fish out of water. That's what makes golf so challenging compared to other sports.
It's fascinating you should bring that up because in the 90s, I got to know Ernie Els very well. I covered the Sunshine Tour, and he was a huge rugby fan, and is. Played number 8 at school, loved Transvaal, as they were then. And at the same time as Ernie was coming up, Colin Montgomery was the best player in Europe, and of course never won a major. Now, here's the difference between the two. When you watched Monty play, you could see that he was waiting to be interrupted. He was looking for a guy in a red shirt 200 meters away who'd moved just as he took the club back. Ernie had that wonderful ability to switch off, take 15 seconds to play his shot, and then go back to what he was doing. So I'll give you an example. When he won his first $1 million,
Yes.
I was walking with him, and I've never seen in the flesh anybody strike the ball the way that Ernie did that day. The sound of the ball off the club was quite wonderful. And he just hit a shot into 17, probably on the Friday. And it was before they'd remodeled 17 and put it out into the lake. And he hit his shot, gave his club back to his caddy, looked over his shoulder and saw me, and came marching over, and I thought he was going to cuck me out for being in his line. He said, "So what do you think about Transvaal this year? What do you think about the back row? I quite like Combrink, right?" and we had a conversation walking up to the green. I then left him alone. He went and made the birdie putt and carried on. And that was an example of why he was a great player. He had the ability to turn on and turn off. And I think if you look across all sports, the people who can do that are the ones who really excel.
Yeah, Daniel Carter was really good at that. I saw a post of his on Instagram the other day, and he spoke about, I think he referred to them as zones, being in the blue zone and the red zone. Red zone being when you start to think about everything other than what you are wanting to do. In his case, it was kicking a goal. And he mentioned a particular kick where it was either the British and Irish Lions or he was playing Ireland in Ireland. And he had lined up a kick, and he found himself thinking about all these Irish people that are essentially encouraging him to miss. And then he went through his process again and was able to step back, move from his red zone into his blue zone to be able to focus on narrowing the focus, be still and calm in the moment, and then focus on executing, being target focused rather than what everything else is going on around you. And I think that's what makes that is uniform across all elite sportsmen at the really top level, irrespective of the sport that they play. They're able to move in and out of that space almost on command.
And you don't know what it is until you see it. You're talking about Dan Carter. I remember doing a test match at Loftus. Bram van Straten against Australia. Bram had been dropped for the previous game, which was at Newlands. Percy Montgomery had taken over the kicking and sprayed it all over the place. They brought Bram back because they needed a kicker. And Bram kicked all the points that day. The Springboks won narrowly. And at the end of the game, I was doing a piece in those days for Boots and All called Cappy's Corner. And they used to give me a camera wherever I was, and I'd say to the camera, right, we're going to do this today. And on this particular day, I said, right, while they're still on the field, let's go and do Bram. You couldn't do it today. You know, the security would get you. I walked out onto the field, and I knew Bram well, and he saw me, and he said, "Hey, how you doing?" Took off his headgear. And I said, "Do you mind, a couple of minutes?" "No problem." What was the first question I asked him? "How nervous were you?" And he said, "I don't get nervous." He said, "My job is to kick goals. If I don't do my job, they can drop me." And it was a revelation to me, and something that I carry forward. When I see a kicker having a bad day, I don't say, "Oh, shame." I say, well, he's going to have to work harder because that's his job.
Yes, absolutely. Roy Keane is very notorious for saying that, and quite scathing of the United players, especially of late, of just being able to do your job. He makes me laugh so much. When they show this De Gea, I think it was, who made this incredible save, and the anchor of the show brought Roy in to give his thoughts on this miraculous save from De Gea, and he said, well, it's his job. He's the goalkeeper. You're supposed to stop the ball from going in the goal. Don't mind like the unbelievable athletic achievement of just being able to get to that ball and to stop it, and the significance of stopping that. No, well, that's his job. What else do you want from him? Andy, over the years, you must have, you've commentated on a variety of sports and you've covered a variety of sports and you've made mention of these elite athletes already. Is there a particular game, event, interview that stands out to you as something that has left you in awe?
Yes, and you would never guess it in a million years. I was at the Atlanta Olympics, and I'm not going to talk about Michael Johnson, who won the 400 meters. And
was that 96?
That was 96.
Yes.
In Atlanta. It was a day off for the major sports, and Colin Bryden, who was the sports editor of the Sunday Times, and a good friend of mine, he's retired and living in Stellenbosch these days. He said to me, "Let's go and see Suleimanoglu." And I said, "Who's Suleimanoglu?"
That's what I wanted to ask you.
Right. So, in 1996, Naim Suleimanoglu of Turkey was the defending Olympic champion, and indeed had won the last 3 Olympics, weightlifter.
Okay.
And I can't remember the weight category that he was lifting in. But Colin said, "This guy's won 3 golds. Let's go and see if he can win a 4th gold." And we went to this hall. And I told you about feeling out of place at Ellis Park with everything in Afrikaans. Went to this hall, and the 2 best weightlifters at the Olympics in this weight category were Suleimanoglu and a guy from Greece. And it turned out that the guy from Greece was actually Turkish, but he'd taken out Greek citizenship because he knew he could never beat Suleimanoglu, right? So you had this hall with about 3,000 people seated in it, with an aisle down the middle to separate one from the other. And the Greeks were on the right and the Turks were on the left. And if you look at the history of the First World War, you'll understand how important it was that we had that aisle down the middle. They just wanted to kill each other. And there was a war going on stage, a proxy war, so that they didn't kill each other, the Turks and the Greeks. And Suleimanoglu went up against this guy, and I can't remember his name because it's actually unimportant. Suleimanoglu won.
Yes.
Won his 4th Olympic gold medal. And if it hadn't been for Colin Bryden saying, "Come on, let's go," I would never have experienced that. And the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. When I start talking about it now, it was just the most electric atmosphere you can possibly imagine. I used to do a lot of rock concerts when I was a young man.
Okay.
And I went to some amazing stuff. But I never experienced an atmosphere like that day.
Jeez. I would never have said that that's where you were going to go. As a South African, as a Durbanite, I immediately assume that it's going to be a rugby match or a cricket match, or, I know you write for The Complete Golfer, so something golf-related. But that's the story of sport, and that's the beauty of sport. There's all these stories, significant stories, to share with one another that we can learn from and apply to our own lives. And that's why sport has been such a big part of my life. I've played all the sports growing up. And there's so much significance that one can take and apply off the sports field. And I'm sure that you, being involved in sports so heavily for the majority of your life, you feel the same way. But explain to me, please, what makes a good commentator?
Be yourself.
Be yourself.
That's one of the things. You get an awful lot of people come in and they try and sound like what they've heard on the TV or on the radio. Or on YouTube, and people can see through that. Yeah. A commentator starting out at King's Park, and I'm not going to mention his name because he's a good friend, he turned up for his first commentary with a list of one-liners, and he ticked them off as he delivered them through the game. And of course, he wasn't in the rhythm of the game because he was looking for a way to get his one-liner in. People always talk about when it's me, I always mention a school, and that's because I learned it from Hugh Blayton. But what you will hear from me is if there's a story, if there's a backstory to somebody on the field, I will love to give that story. But to be a good commentator, you have to prepare. Sometimes you can't. You just get thrown into it. But if you do have the opportunity to prepare, you get all your notes ready and have them in front of you. But here's the thing: if you've done your job properly, you haven't used more than 20% of your notes.
Yes, I love that.
You hope that the game has taken over, that there isn't time to fit in a little piece of information about his here's my favorite one-liner. Michael House were playing about 4 years ago. The tight head prop was a guy called Max Ray, whose grandmother was Miss World. and that's just fantastic. And you have to use that line.
Yes.
There was but I'm talking about 20%. So I did Sharks Cardiff 2 weeks ago here.
Watch that game.
They had a loose head prop. I think he started, and I can't think of his name now. Domachowski, that was his name. Very odd name for a Welshman. And I couldn't get in to the commentary the fact that his father escaped from Auschwitz.
What?
And fetched up in Wales and became a miner. Not his father, his grandfather.
Yes.
His grandfather escaped from Auschwitz, went to Wales, became a miner, and here's his grandson playing at Kings Park. And I couldn't use the line because there wasn't a moment in the game.
Yeah. So, Andy, how did you come across those facts? Is this all done in the prep work and the build-up?
Yeah. So Mr. Google is your friend.
Yes.
Didn't used to be able to do that. I mean, when I started as a journalist in South Africa, there were no computers, there were no smartphones. I did a tournament in Nairobi, cricket tournament, ICC trophy. The Nairobi Times, I think it was, had a writer called Macbeth, a white guy. He had an old-fashioned manual typewriter, and he had a runner. He would take his piece of paper out, give it to the runner, who would literally run into town to his office. That is 30 years ago. Sure. Now here we are. You can just push a button and everything goes. But in those days, dictation. At the end of, I mentioned $1 Million earlier. Used to do lots of different media at the $1 Million. And you'd be there until 9 o'clock at night dictating, because there were 5 or 6 different media houses that needed the story, and you couldn't just press a button.
Yeah, you've moved on to my next question without me having to ask it, which was, how has journalism and commentary changed over the years? Is there anything specific to commentary that you've noticed apart from that's changed over the years? Perhaps the style of commentary, how you interact with the listener?
Yeah, I think to its detriment, people hear too much these days. And when I was growing up, I was very lucky that the BBC had great commentators at every sport. Peter Allis on golf, who had learned everything he knew from Henry Longhurst. And if you're listening to this and you don't know who Henry Longhurst is, go out and get one of his books. They're absolutely magnificent. If you're interested in golf, read Henry Longhurst. It's old-fashioned, but it's fantastic. Peter O'Sullivan did horse racing. You had David Coleman doing athletics. You had a whole bunch of guys who weren't necessarily ex-sportsmen. Some of them were, but they were individuals, and they'd come up through the rigors of the BBC style. In those days, you never got thrown onto TV straight from the field of play. It was assumed that you needed to be trained first. So what's happened over the last 30 years, particularly with satellite broadcasting, is that there's that recognition factor that production houses go for. You stick a recently retired player in front of the camera because people know who he is. Yes. The fact that he's talking gibberish is irrelevant as far as they're concerned, not as far as I'm concerned. And so there isn't really anything I can tell an up-and-coming commentator other than be yourself and listen to other people and try and take the best of what you're hearing from. But don't start talking like Australians and New Zealanders who have those clipped phrases. And,
the Aussies love that. Greg Martin, I remember, in Super Rugby.
But I mean, the best Super Rugby commentator of them all was Gordon Bray, and he was ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation. He'd come up old school. Gordon's still alive and still doing it, and a magnificent commentator, somebody who'd always done his prep, who was never bombastic, but when it was important to be loud, he was loud.
Yes.
That's the other thing, don't shout into the microphone.
Yes.
Open your epiglottis. And then to turn to the journalism side of the question, I'm afraid to say that my profession, which I like to call it, is dying. In sport. When I go to Kings Park today, there's nobody in the press box. There'll be a few people who gather for the press conference afterwards, which is live streamed, and everybody is filming with their phones. Very few people are asking questions of any detail whatsoever. And all of the things that we used to learn at press conferences, which were almost, in many instances, they were before the press conference started and after it finished, because you had a chance to just sort of relax and chat. That's all gone. The other thing, when I was first coming to Kings Park, Ian McIntosh was the coach, and I learnt South African rugby from standing next to Mac in the bar post-match. And he would have a whiskey, and I would have a beer, and I wasn't alone. There would be other people around as well, and we would just talk about the game. And that is gone from journalists coming up now. They don't have that access to the players and the coaches that we had back then. Nowadays, the only time you get to see a player is when there's an organized press conference.
Yes. And there's none of that authentic, organic communication, like you say, over a drink, just being, two men in a bar discussing their love for rugby or their love for cricket or their love for whatever sport that is. A question off the cuff. Over your years, is there a particular sportsman, coach, that you feel the public has misunderstood?
Yes, Rudolf Streuli.
Okay.
Rudolf Streuli is a friend of mine. Let me get that out of the way straight away. I went on the Springbok tour with Kitch Christie in 1994 to Europe when Rudolf was at his absolute peak, and he scored a try against Scotland that Bill McLaren commentated on. And
there's another legend.
There's another legend. I was lucky enough to work with Bill, and Rudolf on that tour really came to prominence. But it wouldn't have made a difference to me had it not been for the fact that his father Hans was on tour to watch his son play, and Hans Streuli had played against Hugh Bladen, and Hugh was with me, and so we went out drinking together. So I got to know the Streuli family and a little bit about why it's Streuli and not Strowley, and that it's Swiss. And I then became good friends with Rudolf. And the Camp Staldrad thing, unfortunately, he will carry to his grave. Yeah. When Rudolf dies, somebody will write about Camp Staldrad, and that is not Rudolf. I think he made a mistake, but the rest of his rugby career, the work that he does behind the scenes contractually, because he's a trained lawyer like his father, that's what he's used for. And bear in mind, Rudolf used to work the scoreboard at Loftus when he was a boy, and rugby is shot through the man. His daughter plays very good netball. Of course, his son is playing professional rugby. And Rudolf, whenever I see him, he will always come over and chat. And yes, if there's one person I'd like to rehabilitate, it would be Rudolf.
You made mention earlier of books. I've noticed that you do a cover to cover when you give book reviews, and you've been involved in a number of books yourself. Is there a favorite book of yours that you've either been a part of or read that you've enjoyed the most?
Catch-22.
Yes, what's that?
Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. It's a war. It's a comedy about war that came out in 1963. Masterpiece. Just go and read it. Don't listen to anybody else. Go and read Catch-22. But I'm glad you mentioned Cover to Cover, because obviously there'll be a sporting following to this. Cover to Cover is devoted to sporting books. We're up to number 101. It started during lockdown, when we couldn't use studios. So we had to be creative. And I film it on my phone in front of my bookshelf at home. And I write to publishers, and they have books delivered to me. And if there's one book that you need to read, it's Yarnia by Dougal MacDonald. It's the story of his one and only Test match against the British Lions at Loftus Versfeld in 1974. It's funny and sad. It's about the good old days and the bad old days. It's a masterpiece. 10 out of 10. That was my book of the year 3 years ago. And then Mike Greenaway wrote The Fireside Springbok last year, which is a lavish hardcover book filled with what I love best, stories. Stories that you don't just come across. I'll give you an example. Peter Steph du Toit.
Yes.
Now, when Peter Steph started at the Sharks playing under 19, I got to commentate on him. And Etienne Finn told me, do you know his grandfather played for the Springboks? And I said, who was his grandfather? And he said, Piet Spure du Toit. And in Mike Greenaway's book, The Fireside Springbok, is the story of the du Toit family. So Peter Steph is actually Peter Steph the seventh, because the first boy in the family is always called Peter Steph. And they've been on the same Cape farm for 250 years.
Wow.
And that's why Peter Steph left the Sharks. He had to go back to the family farm and play for the Stormers. So Piet Spure du Toit, for those who don't speak Afrikaans, Spure, muscles, was part of a legendary Springbok front row. My late father-in-law, who died last week, I'm going over to the funeral next week. He played against Avril Malan's Springboks in 1960-61. He captained the north of England against the Boks. He played for England against them, and he scored the first try in the only game that the Boks lost on tour against the Barbarians at Cardiff Arms Park. And he told me, and I'm talking about Derek Morgan, he told me that the whole Springbok pack was great, but the front row was special. And that, in his opinion, was why they were so effective. And Piet Spure du Toit was the hooker. And the old man was a hard nut. And he said, that's the hardest guy I've ever played against, was Piet Spure du Toit.
Wow.
And he died relatively young, around about 57 years old. I think a tractor accident. But read about it in the Fireside Springboks. That's the sort of stories that you'll find in there.
Jeez, and you can identify and relate more with the players of the current Springbok crop. And Chasing the Sun has actually done a great job of that. Two wonderful documentaries. We cross our fingers for Chasing the Sun 3 in 3 years' time. But I thought that was such a wonderful documentary, and how we got to know the players behind the green and gold jersey. You know, that famous story of Mapimpi with the faces on the numbers at the back and his background. Why do you think rugby, of all sports in South Africa, has been able to captivate the public in a modern sense? Because the World Cups, both 2019 and 2023, seem to have captivated the entire nation more so than any other sport that I've experienced in this country. And I feel that most of the South Africans would share the same opinion as me.
Well, you're probably too young to remember the Cup of Nations that we won in 1996.
I know of it, yes.
That brought the nation together in a far more diverse way than the Rugby World Cup of 1995, because instead of having a few black people in the stadium, you had a few white people in the stadium.
Yes.
And I was lucky enough to cover that tournament. And Shoes Mshweyu is, in my humble opinion, the best soccer player that this country has ever produced. And it was just a really, really good team. And people got behind them, and Nelson Mandela did the same thing that he did for Francois, and inspired the team, wore the captain's jersey, etc., etc. Going back to why did 2019 and 23 bring the country together? Because we won. There's no substitute in sport for winning. You can play the best rugby, the best soccer, the best cricket, but if you don't win, nobody cares.
Yeah.
And it's always been my opinion as well, because everybody will say, well, it's Rassie. My opinion, that has been formulated over 60 years watching sport, is that great teams are made up of great players. You can have the best coach, but if he hasn't got something to work with, he's not going to win on a regular basis. She's not going to win on a regular basis. And when you go through the World Cup winning sides of 95, 2007, 2019, 2023, you can just tick them off.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned the work that you do at schools and Craven Week, etc. You must have got quite a good eye for talent identification. Are there current, could be Springbok rugby players, could be cricketers, if we take another avenue, that you've noticed that schoolboy rugby or schoolboy cricket, schoolboy sport, and you've been able to see, wow, if that guy stays fit, all things being equal, world beater?
Yeah, you see them every day. Our schools system churns them out across the line. Hockey is a huge emerging sport in this country. If it hadn't been for the fact that we have a dysfunctional national body, hockey would be on the launch pad now to be absolutely enormous. But I think I have developed a bit of an eye, and I'll tell you a story because I'm going to DHS later this morning. About 6 or 7 years ago, I did DHS against Glenwood at DHS, and I saw Pepsi Buthelezi and Sanelli Nohamba for the first time. And Buthelezi scored an amazing try that I actually saw on YouTube recently. But the guy that really stood out was Nohamba, who was the scrum half, wasn't the captain, but he ran the game. I spent my time watching him, talking to people in real time. The ball's live, and he's going, you go and stand over there, you go and do that, make sure you don't let him come through here. And then he would kick the goals, and then he would make a break, and it was the best performance by a school's scrum half that I've ever seen. And wow. I was devastated when the Sharks thought they didn't need him. And now look at him at the Lions, playing fly half and scrum half. Everybody's talking about him. They should never have let him go. Yeah,
that's always a sore topic among Sharks fans, their recruitment policy and who they've let go. Look, Amani Libok is another example. Couldn't really find his place in the Sharks team between himself, Kerwin Bosch, fullback and fly half, and then got backed by the Stormers, and then has turned into quite a marvellous little player.
So it's a little bit of a hobby horse of mine that there's not enough KwaZulu-Natal schooled players in the Sharks side. And it never used to be the case. It was unusual that somebody came in from outside when I started. James Small would be an example of somebody who was brought in from outside. And of course there was the Free State connection.
Yes.
With Andre Hubert and Henry Honorable. The most important little bit of Free State connection was, of course, the generation that included Ruan Pienaar, Bismarck and Yanni du Plessis. And I did...
and Francois Steyn.
And Francois Steyn. Now, I did Ruan Pienaar at Craven Week in Pietermaritzburg. And Casey Pienaar was an old friend of mine. And he came into the box. I was commentating with Garth Wright. And so Ruan was still at Grey College. And at the end of the game, Casey came in and spoke to Garth and said, listen, my boy wants to be a scrum half. He's short of a few things. Would you mind spending a bit of time with him? And Garth took his headphones off and said, let's go. And that was the fellowship of the game. You know, the Casey and Garth had played for the Springboks together. Now, here's a boy who's got lots of natural talent, but he needs a few rough edges knocking off. And now, where were we? Last week, Ruan played his last game of rugby.
Yeah.
At the age of 41. I mean, I would never, ever have thought that was possible. But his career was made by that transition to the Sharks at an important time. Because bear in mind, they all came up through the same under 18, under 21 teams, and in normal life, they would have stayed in Bloemfontein and perhaps not have achieved what they achieved. But when Ruan came to the Sharks, I remember commentating on his debut, and he had this flaring pace. That's the one thing that sets players apart, is that you give them the ball, there's half a gap, bang, gone. After his first season of Super Rugby, probably into his second season, I'm walking through the car park at Kings Park, and here's Casey. Hey, how you doing? What are you doing here? No, he said, it's Ruan's 21st. I said, oh, marvellous. So you come down to watch games. So what, have you got him a nice present? He said, yeah, washing machine. He said, he can't send his laundry home all the time. No, he needs a washing machine. He's a big boy now.
Yeah, I remember that try that he scored in broken play, and he weaved through. It was almost like a wonderfully balanced runner. You know, he would glide. You know, you've got those players that would glide. Christian Cullen was another one who would just glide through defenses. It never seemed like sidestepping and going around players was anything difficult. It just seemed to, those guys seemed to keep still.
Yeah.
They just moved around.
They used to say about Serge Blanco, the French would say, he doesn't leave tracks on snow.
Oh, what a wonderful saying. Andy, before we finish off, it would be remiss of me not to ask you about this particular test match that in my prep I came across on YouTube, and it was the Springboks versus Ireland in Pretoria in 1998. And you were commentating on that game. And it basically, the Springboks won, but it became a slugfest. Do you remember that game in any great detail?
Not in any great detail, but I remember the amount of punches that were thrown. And if you look back at it now, I mean, they would have had to abandon the game because there would have been half a dozen red cards. Yeah. And you can't play 12 aside in front of a full house. And actually, if you go back to the start of Super Rugby, you'll realise how much the laws have changed since then. You know, the head-high tackles that we used to just take for granted are gone from the game. You see a head clash now, it's a red card. Off you go. Sorry, I didn't mean it. No, sorry. It's in the laws now. That Irish tour, Ireland were a decent side. I remember that. And the Springboks, of course, were playing in white, yes, as they traditionally do against Ireland. And I remember the crowd baying for blood. David van der Sant told me a lovely story when he was on tour with the Boks in '93 in Argentina, and they played Tucumán. And it was a bigger fight than the Ireland Test match. And he said there were members of the Springbok coaching squad stood on the side of the field. When the fight started, they would just shout, "Mura!" Yeah, you wouldn't get away with that today. And Tucumán got banned from playing against international sides for 10 years after that game.
Jeez. What a wonderful story. Andy, yeah?
I'll tell you one more violent game was Neath in 1994. Neath played in all black, and they were captained by Gareth Llewellyn, who was a Welsh lock. And there was a fight that started in the Neath 22, and Andre Hubert and one Neath player and James Dalton were at the other end of the field. I think they'd been getting up from injury or something. But the other 27 people were all fighting under the posts at the Neath end. Juba and the Neath guy were just folding their arms and watching what was going on. James Dalton ran 70 meters to join the fight.
Yeah.
found the tallest guy, 6'8" Andrew Kembury, and leapt at him. And after the game,
That sounds about right.
after the game, we had a little press conference in the stands because they weren't expecting to have to do a press conference. And I asked the first question. I said, Gareth, have you ever played in a more violent game than that? And he looked at me and said, oh yeah, lots.
And yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed our chat, so much so I haven't even touched my coffee that we got before the episode. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Before we leave, where can people find you if they want to follow your journey, if they want to look out for any articles that you're writing, cover to cover, etc., etc.?
Yeah, just keep an eye on Supersport. I do another thing called Cappy's Corner,
Yes.
which is features on interesting sporting people. I did Mike Pengelly recently. Mike Pengelly is the only man to have swum all 50 mid-mile miles. And he lives up the north coast, wonderful guy. So watch out for those. They're all short. They can be dropped in when you least expect it. Yeah, I write for Complete Golfer. I do the odd book. I've got a book that I sort of ghost wrote, which is in the shops now. It's called Saving South Africa.
Mm-hmm. What's that about?
It's about the Umgeni municipality and the changes under the new mayor Chris Pappas and the deputy mayor Sandile Umnakati. Recommended. They have some really interesting things to say about governance in South Africa. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm A Capostagno at. I think that's my handle.
Yeah, I'll include it in the show notes, the link, yeah.
Okay, good. But I don't tweet a lot. I'm old,
Yes.
remember. What else can I tell you? That's about it, I think.
Thank you. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and good luck for your games later this afternoon. Not so fast. It is such a cool feeling when I see that Spotify subscribers number increase on the weekly, when I see the number of people listening to the episodes going up, and it really makes a huge difference. Have you ever done something and you feel so good when you get rewarded by some positive feedback and you really feel like you're making a difference? That's what it means to me, and that's how I feel. And it goes a long way. If you like the show, share it and subscribe it. Thank you humbly, and I'll see you next week.